Welcome to Rome, the Eternal City. From the Sistine Chapel to the Pantheon to the Spanish Steps, Rome houses more must-see sights than anywhere else in the world. We're here continuing this tutorial to talk about balancing the perfect amount of natural versus artificial light using ancient and beautiful architectural sites. So Rome has become my favorite city in the world, and I've been traveling here multiple times a year since 2009. So I like to think that I've really helped establish my greatest portfolio of work in Rome. This has really become my comfort zone in photography and one of my favorite places to practice. So with this tutorial, I really wanted it to be an all-encompassing tutorial about all of the different types of architecture around the world. So I picked Cinque Terre because it's a great blend between the natural landscape and the beautiful cliffs, coastline, and also the villages that are mixed throughout. Rome's a little bit different because while it's an urban environment, it's also ancient architecture. It's completely different than the modern architecture we're going to see in Singapore and Hong Kong. So Rome is really a unique city for photography because we have these great old iconic buildings that are lit beautifully at night. And during the blue hour, we get that great blue color in the sky that perfectly complements the warm lights on the city in the foreground. So specifically here in Rome, we're going to focus on a few core techniques like getting starbursts on light and how perspective changes around shooting in bridges. We're really going to focus on the blue hour, sunrise and sunset, and then we're going to use some time blending techniques to blend sunrise and sunset with blue hour and night photography. Now Rome is very beautiful, but it does have its unique challenges. So we're going to have to do a lot of subtle things in post-processing to really get the best out of our shots. Now with Rome and with that complexity, we're going to have to step things up a little bit and use a few more advanced techniques that we haven't used before. I couldn't be more excited to be back in my favorite city in the world. Rome is going to be really exciting. I can't wait to get started. Let's go get some shots. So it's another beautiful day in Rome, beautiful morning I should say. We got up at about 5:30 to leave at 6 o'clock so we could get to the Forum overlook here bright and early and ready to capture the blue hour. Now behind me is probably one of the most famous overlooks in all of Rome, and it overlooks the entire old Roman Forum, all these old columns, all the way back into the end, into the distance. You can actually see the Colosseum. And we're lucky enough that the Romans basically leave the lights on all night. So all of the lights that you see come on for the monuments at night will also be on in the morning, and they turn off just before the sun comes up. So you have the ability to capture both PM blue hours and really nice AM blue hours if you get up early enough. Morning blue hours are a lot different than PM blue hours. Not just that you have to get up early, but you have to arrive before the blue hour begins. At nighttime, we can get there at sunset and we can watch the blue hour turn into the moment that we really want. But in the morning, we have to get there sometimes at full dark and set up in the dark, so it can be very hard to see through our camera. What I usually do, if it's really dark when I arrive, is I'll set the camera up the best I can, looking through the viewfinder and the LCD, and I'll take quick shots at high ISO in the dark until I can get my composition just right. Once I have my composition locked, I make sure everything's focused, set up, and ready to go, even if I have to do 30-second exposures. At least I've tested everything so that I know I have exactly what I want. So this is the first time in this tutorial where we've actually shot a morning blue hour into the sun. So the brighter the sky gets with the sun coming up in the background, the more it washes out the colors and lights in the foreground. So it's a really fine balance to find the right blue hour. So what we're going to have to do is shoot all the way through the event from very, very early when it's really dark all the way to when the sun comes up. And then in post, what we'll do is we'll look at the frames to figure out which one has the best balance between that natural light from the sky and the artificial light from the foreground. When I first arrived, there was this really nice clear spot in the sky that stretched all the way to the right, past the end of this scene that I wanted to capture. So I set up this camera, the Nikon D810, to capture a really wide scene. Now, since it looked like the clouds were going to start drifting to the left pretty rapidly, I decided to set up a second camera as well to be able to capture a tighter composition. And I decided to use a clamp, which is a perfectly secure way to get my second camera to capture something without having any vibration. It also gives me more room to move around here freely and not block anybody else who would happen to be here shooting today. This little clamp made by Really Right Stuff is probably my favorite piece of equipment that I own. I use it in so many different scenarios, not just when I need a second camera and I have a perfect railing to clamp it to, but I also take it into places where tripods aren't allowed. The other thing that I really love about it is I can take the clamp plus the TFA01, those little tripod legs that I have, and I can swap that little ball head between the two. So I always carry the clamp, the tripod legs, and an extra little ball head no matter where I go. This morning we're really lucky. We're actually the only people here, which is really rare. I think it's just because it's the winter time here in Rome, which is the extreme off season. So it's kind of a treat to have this whole place to myself in the morning. But basically, camera one is doing a wide shot because I want to capture the sky, just in case the sky starts to open up, if there's any color back there from the sunrise, or that window starts to stretch out and give me a nice composition in the sky, as well as the foreground. Where this one zoomed in just a little bit tighter, so it still frames a portion of the Colosseum way in the background, these columns which are really important, but it cuts off a little bit more of that dead space on the right. The only thing that's really good to make sure that you do not do with a composition like this, since you do have a little bit of threshold of movement from left to right, is make sure none of the important elements are being obscured by other elements. So as I move to the left and right here, these columns in the foreground will move because of the parallax. They possibly could cover up maybe a church back there, or the big arch, these beautiful arches. So if I moved a little bit more to the left, the columns might cover up the arch, and vice versa. If I moved a little bit further to the right, the other columns might start covering up the arch. So I position myself right in the middle so I kind of have a little bit of everything without anything important covering up anything else. I feel this is a really good distribution of parallax for the shot. Now, since I am shooting into a bright sky, I have to use a little bit of bracketing to be able to capture the sky and all the details and the highlights, as well as pull out the extreme shadows, because this is a scene that does have extreme shadows as well. So in the beginning, when I first got into the blue hour, just after it stopped being too dark to shoot, my main exposure was about 30 seconds at f8. So instead of enabling bracketing in the normal 1 under or 1 over, I decided to bracket 1 under so I could expose for the highlights and still get the full 30-second exposure. As the scene started to brighten up, I just went ahead and enabled the normal exposure bracketing of -1 and +1 so I could also compensate for those shadows. For a scene like this in the post-processing, what makes it difficult is we have extreme light coming from the sky, which is extreme natural light, and then we have a very small amount of light from the artificial light. So these columns are lit, some of the temples, the arch and everything is lit with a yellow color. Now usually all yellow on objects, if you have yellow casting on yellow, can be a big problem. But in this case, yellow can really complement the blue of the sky. So what I'd like to do in post probably is warm up the tones in the foreground and use them to complement the tones in the background. The difficulty with a shot like this, since there is a minimal amount of light in the foreground, is finding that balance of light and dark. How much do we push those highlights, the objects that are lit, and how much do we pull up the shadows in those dark areas without making it look fake? So we have to find a good balance of how dark to leave the shadows or which details to pull out of the shadows so they help complement the natural light that's in the sky and also the artificial light that's already there in the foreground. So this is something that we're going to have to experiment a little bit in post-processing to find the right balance. In my photography, I really enjoy using the contrast of warm light against cool light in the background. And that's good because Rome has a lot of those examples. But it looks really nice when you have something warmly lit, nice tones of yellow, against a really beautiful, crystal blue sky. So that's something I try to really take advantage of here in Rome and in a lot of parts of Europe. The background in this video should look very cold. coldly white balance, basically. But there are these yellow lights just beyond me on this building here that are illuminating me. I also have one little panel light that's warm on me, too, to correctly expose so that you guys can actually see me and hear me at the same time. So this is basically a similar situation to what I'm going to have to manage in this scene, with the foreground, me, being very warm, and the background, everything over there, being very cold. Just a quick note about the camera settings. They're both set to f8, and their lowest ISO settings for the D810, that's 64. For the Fuji X-T1, that's 200. That has not changed throughout the entire shooting sequence. So arriving here this morning, the clouds had a lot more potential than they do now. So I left my camera in a static position so I could do my signature blending style. And I was hoping that I was able to capture the blue hour and then the sunrise. And I was hoping that that sunrise turned into some really beautiful colors. And then in Photoshop, I could take those beautiful colors of the sky and blend them into the blue hour scene to create something really, really good. But it changed a little bit. These clouds rolled in. They're obscuring the sun and all the colors that I might have. But as a consequence, a positive consequence, they're also really dark, dramatic clouds. So I think what I'm going to do in post instead is take the best version of the blue hour shot and just make it overly dramatic. So pull a lot of texture in the sky, a lot of details in the foreground, and really make this a cool blue hour shot. So now it's time to take it into post and see how we can make it into a great photo. Well, we are back in the studio. We have left beautiful Vernazza, and now we're in Rome again, and we're going to be focusing on the first blue hour shot of the Imperial Forum, which is a beautiful vantage point in Rome where you get to see all of the old columns and structures all the way back to the Colosseum. So thinking back to the in-camera portion of this lesson, I was talking about arriving very early. So this is an AM blue hour, which means you have to get and arrive, set up at full dark, shoot through full dark all the way through the sunrise. In this case, it was severely backlit too, so it washed out some of the foreground. We're going to have to do a few things in post to mitigate some of that yellow wash color that happened and some of the backlighting. Just have everything have a beautiful tonality all the way throughout the image from foreground to background. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, we are in Capture One. Something to point out about this file, remember I shot this two different ways. With the Fuji X-T1, I did a slightly cropped version. With the D810, I did a wider version. Since the sky never really turned into something too great, I decided to work in the Fuji X-T1, which is slightly zoomed in, so I get more focus on these elements here. So you can see the Colosseum on the right, you can see these towers, and you can see this beautiful arch and everything here. This is the neutral exposure. This is basically straight out of camera, and you can see that the sky is really blown out. We are losing the sky, we are losing the column. That's not good at all. We can see the shadows here a little bit better, or more dark, but we can see the highlights are a little bit better, but you can see that we're still losing a little bit of the sky. So we're going to have to do a couple things here. We're going to use two of these exposures. This one we don't need at all, but this one actually shows how we're getting some of that atmospheric haze, and some of that backlighting is actually causing hazy background and, less clarity overall. The first thing we're going to do, though, is we're going to take the shadows layer and we're going to go ahead and adjust for the highlights, see if we can get any of this sky back. But before we do that, I want to point out that since we are using Fuji X-T1 files, there is no distortion or vignetting. It is all removed inside the camera. It's done with an algorithm inside the lenses, so you never have to worry about that. So if you're using Fujifilm cameras and lenses, leave this to 0. You don't need to change it. You can see that it doesn't have any sharpness fall off whatsoever. They make great cameras and lenses. Let's go right to the adjustments here. Let's say that this is going to become our base exposure. So obviously we're going to have to crank up the shadows a little bit just to compensate because they are very dark. Second thing I want to do is pull those highlights down. You can see by pulling those highlights down helps a little bit. I'm actually picking up some of those purple hues and the subtle details back there. I don't have anything else that's blown out except for this area. So what I'm going to do is pull down the exposure a little bit to compensate. Really what I want to do is get as much of the detail of the sky back, and I want to pull the shadows out. So this is cool because I'm not going to use this entire layer. I'm just focusing on the sky. I've gotten some of the details back in the sky that I wanted. And now I'm going to use this layer, and that's going to take precedent in my foreground. So let's adjust this one too. We can push this a little bit further in the shadows so we can go a little bit brighter a little bit brighter than this one. So this one's going to be replaced with this one in the foreground. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and do all this first. The reason being is we have some important things to take care of here in Capture One before we take this into Photoshop. Usually I'd go right into Photoshop, but clearly there's some yellow color cast going on here. What I'm going to do is go back into the Colors panel, and I'm going to do two different things. First thing I'm going to do is adjust the white balance to cool it off. If I cool the Kelvin temperature down a little bit, you can see that I'm actually going to get some of those blues back, and it's going to help add blue to the background and also fix some of the clarity of the yellows. But by doing that, I may have to adjust the tint just a little bit. Right now to the left, it's going to make it green. To the right, it's going to add a little bit of magenta. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull the magenta in just a little bit, just so that I can mitigate some of the yellow and cause some separation. A little bit further, I want to go down here. Now, I've never used this so far before, but what I can actually do is adjust the saturation in different levels here. And this is really nice. So in this scene, for example, I can actually take this and expand it so that inside the yellows and the oranges here, think of this as what we've been doing with hue saturation, but I can grab this whole area and you can see that I can start to change things like the lightness. It'll actually bring the lightness up overall, and I can actually take the saturation down a little bit. Not too much, but what I can do is start to pull a little bit of it out. It's to make it a little bit less intense and yellow. And some fine tuning here is all it's going to take to bring this back to something that has a little bit more normality. So what I like to do here is I'm just going to say 4500. I'm going to make this easy for myself, and negative 3.5. So I'm not going to copy these values by right-clicking and copying, but since I know what they are, it's 4500, negative 3.5, I can actually just go ahead and paste them in here. So there we go. Second thing that I want to do is just go ahead and see what I did with my yellows here. It wasn't that much, but it was actually about negative 6 and 3.2, so I'm just going to go ahead and change that. This doesn't have to be perfect, but I want it to be similar to what I did before. So we'll just go ahead and do something like that. Actually, it was lightness there, so we'll pull the saturation down just a hair. Just a little tiny bit. That looks good. It's hard because we have a darker and a lighter version. It's hard to tell if they're exactly the same. Now it's time to bring this into Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and export the first adjusted base. Here we go. I'm actually going to bring this into a layer that I already have with my original raw. So now I'm going to put this in as the adjusted raw. Let's go back into Capture One, clear that notification, and go back to this next layer. Now I want to go ahead and make one final adjustment here to the highlights, and we'll pull the shadows up even more there. I may even want to adjust the shadows here just to pull them up. I want to make sure that I get all those shadows back, and we'll go ahead and bring this one in as well. There we go. Bring this one in on top. So this is going to be adjusted raw. And something happened, my copy didn't work, so I'm just going to actually go. If this happens, if you do the hotkeys Command-C, Command-A, Command-W, and for some reason it didn't copy it to the clipboard, you can actually open the most recent file again and try it again. So select all, copy, close, and paste. So that works really well. So now we have the adjusted raw. We're going to call this raw highlights. And we'll call this one shadows. First thing I'm going to do is actually figure out how much of this I want to blend in. It doesn't have to be 100%. You can see it's itself over a version of itself. So let's say I want that to be about 75%. 76% will work. Go ahead and add a mask, and I'm basically just going to draw a gradient. It's going to blend basically from here to about here. And I'm going to do a little bit better than that. I'm going to do a softer gradient, so you can see that now I get a little bit more in the foreground. What I might also want to do is take this down just a hair more, and I'm probably going to adjust this gradient. Now I can do that by delinking or unlinking the gradient, selecting the gradient, and doing a transform with Command-T, and you can see here I can actually adjust the way that my gradient works. Just like that. I'll hit Enter, I'll relink this, and now you can see that I have more of an even distribution of light to dark. Again, I can change this until I like the way that it looks. So right now we have the original raw, which definitely needed a little bit of work, and now we have the adjusted raw. And now, just by seeing that, I'll bring it back down to 75%. Here's another reason that I picked the base raw. I want to point out one more thing before we keep working in Photoshop. Back here in Capture One, the exposure time here, 15 seconds. The exposure time here, 30 seconds. Yes, it washes out the sky, but look at what it does to the texture. 15 seconds, these clouds are moving really fast, and it makes them soft. I like the detail. See all that nice blue, all those edges, all the varying shades? I wanted to keep that. That's why I use that as the base layer for the sky. Let's go back into Photoshop. Let's take a look at this. And so far, that's pretty good. So right now, everything's our base blend. But let's really examine this and let's see what's different. What's so different about this one that we haven't addressed before? Well, unfortunately, we were there in the wintertime, and this is what I like to call Roman maintenance. Roman maintenance basically means that they'll leave equipment there for weeks at a time and never do anything with it. That's basically the entire winter. The whole time for the 2 weeks I was in Rome, I wanted to get a shot of this clean without this thing there, but it never went away. So what do you think? Does that look like an old part of the Imperial Forum? Does that fit in at all? No, absolutely not. In fact, it takes away. So what can we do to get rid of it? Well, this is kind of a big issue because it covers up so much detail in the scene. I'm not really sure if I'm going to be able to paint it out. But for this demonstration, I'm going to do my best to try. Create a new layer. And just for laughs, let's see what the content aware does. Please, please, please. Oh, epic fail. That is so bad. Content aware fail strikes again. So we can't get rid of this. Obviously, it has no idea what to do. There's no way to really get rid of this. So what I'm going to do is use the clone stamp, and believe it or not, I'm actually going to go in and systematically remove this from existence. Now, how am I going to do that? Well, let's take a look at some of the detail. Follow the center of my cursor. We have this fence. Jagged, 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 changes all the way down. And we have this fence, so we have detail. Problem is it wraps around the back. This fence wraps around the back, but we have a bunch of grass here. And we have a bunch of pavement. Most of this is just detail that doesn't matter. For example, if I start changing this, like I'm going to continue to clone down this fence for a little while, up until about this point it should match up perfectly. People won't notice the difference. So let's see. If I pick something like 20% flow, and I select the top of the fence, maybe the top of the fence right around here. Bring this over to the top of the fence and I just start painting. I can start to just paint in this fence. Now it's not going to be perfect. But think about this. Even if it's not perfect, it's still better than this thing that's sitting there in the Roman Forum. Nobody wants that in their portfolio whatsoever. So really I can start to paint. And I'm going to get rid of this sign. Actually, while I'm at it, just to make my life easier, I'm going to get rid of this sign right here. Let's paint that fence in. Nobody's going to see little mistakes. They're actually going to notice things that shouldn't be there before they'd notice blemishes. I mean, if you really think about it, all this could be a blemish. There's just junk everywhere. It's an old forum. It's getting dug up. There's all sorts of weird details. So we have a lot of liberty to go in and say, you know what? I think I can add the bottom of the fence and some more rocks in. And I'll just keep doing that. And I'm basically just going to follow this line here. I'm not going to worry too much if the fence posts don't line up or the fence doesn't line up. I'm just worried about creating the ground. Little bits at a time. Nice thing, if I screw up, it's on this layer. I can delete it. Nothing is baked in as of yet. Let's take a break. This detail is very difficult. I have to keep going, basically. Keep recreating areas that didn't exist before. So here's a good example where I can say, all right, here's a corner. Basically, the corner meets the fence here. Here's another corner right here where the fences meet. And I can just keep going. I can keep blending this fence in. Be very careful not to go too high up because I don't want any of the top of that. But again, I'm just going to keep adding that fence. It's okay. We'll get rid of the overlap in a little while. These duplication areas are pretty easy to get rid of. I'm just going to clean it up a little bit. We'll address that again in a few minutes, basically. But I'm basically just covering my own feet here. All right, that looks good. Let's take a break, though. Let's pick texture that doesn't matter. Here's texture that doesn't matter. Rocks. Rocks don't matter. Sorry, rocks. You don't matter. You really don't. Pavement, easy. Easy. So basically, a lot of this is very difficult, and some of it's easy. So what I like to do is jump between difficult areas and easy areas. But really, nobody's telling me that none of this could be here. It could be here, really. Nobody knows if it's not. So really I can get rid of this. I can get rid of this. Now here's where it starts to get fun. Well, let's pick a corner here and go down to this corner. Actually, yeah, we need to pick this corner here. Go down to this corner. And what I can do is just go ahead and click. Once I click, it's going to follow me. It's basically going to follow that edge so that I can just paint in that clean edge. And guess what? It's going to paint in this new corner here too. And follow the top of that fence all the way down into those rocks that I've already created. So we're doing a pretty good job so far, starting to get rid of this. Now we need to start attacking it from the other side. We'll attack it more from the other side here. Same thing, I have this corner. I'm going to move to this corner, click, and then I'm going to be able to go ahead and paint in and out this fence. May lose some of it, which is okay. Because again, it's a lot of detail. It's sort of endless details that we don't really have to have look perfect. So the benefit of this being old Rome is that it doesn't have to look perfect. I'll fix any problems that I created myself. Very easily just fix these problems so that I have a fence. This kind of stuff here is really easy. You can see here, I can always grab this. Try to line edges up. Line more edges up. Get rid of more of this. More of this. And there's some detail. So we've gotten rid of most of it. Let's get rid of this. Now, here's where it gets really fun. Now I'm going to go ahead and start painting in some of this grass. This grass is basically just this green area, so I'm just going to do my best to paint certain things out. I'm going to keep option clicking, and I'm going to bring this in. I'm just going to keep adding more and more green. Don't worry about little areas that look duplicated or you have clone problems where you have duplication. After we go in and lay all the base down, then we can go clean it up. So it's basically broad strokes. Just think about this as a base layer of paint. It's just you're painting by using portions of things that already exist. Most people hate to do this too. I kind of like it for some reason. So there we go. So we have the grass. Now, this might be a good excuse to go ahead and see, how far we've come. Because right now there are some mistakes, but let's see what it looked like before. I mean, that's crazy. We've almost gotten rid of it, and we just have a little bit more to go. So I've already gone from obnoxious piece of equipment to less of that obnoxious piece of equipment. But let's take it the rest of the way. Here's where it's going to get a little bit interesting because this area here has to be completely recreated from scratch. Not from scratch, but basically what we're going to have to do is go ahead and firm up our what we've done so far. And I'm using a light hand on my brush so that I can recreate parts or portions of different pieces of detail. So obviously, if nobody knew it was there in the first place, they'll never know if you removed it or added something else. In this case, we're going to take advantage of this being so far away in such minor detail. Nobody's going to look down here. Nobody at all. Nobody's going to look down here. They're all going to look up here. So we have the look away to our advantage. But what we have to do is just figure out what we're going to do. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to terminate this fence. So I'm going to keep it going, and then I'm going to terminate it right about, let me get past this thing a little bit. What I'm going to do is just terminate the fence. So it stops here. And the rest of it is just going to be grass on top, which I've already created. And now what I'm going to do is continue that grass till about here. So it's going to look like it's the edge of the grass. Now here's where it's going to get fun. I'm going to go ahead and edge that fence as well. So it's just going to be almost like that fence disappears, where it doesn't actually wrap around. I'm going to change my brush, give a harder edge brush, and I'm just going to start to create that edge of the fence. And these rocks here are going to lead right into it, right into that detail. I may actually add some of this light texture of these rocks back into the pavement and some of the dark texture from up here into the pavement just to basically bring it home and add a fade. So basically it looks like what I've done is cut this fence off, and now what I'm going to do is follow the same line around here. These rocks I'm going to follow here, and I'm going to use the pavement to my advantage. Get rid of all this, and I'm going to terminate this fence right around here. Easy. Well, maybe not easy, but not as difficult as you might think. So we're just going to go ahead and create our own edges, almost like this never existed here. So like that fence leads into that fence, and that's about it. Pretty easy. Same thing here. If I want to stop this fence, I can stop it by doing this, pulling this, and we can just kind of get rid of it. Like that fence just leads into the next one. Pull this back down here. Very light opacity just to kind of blend this our own way. Now the other thing we might want to do is soften this transition of grass, just so it looks like it's softening into the hill just a little bit. Just like that. Very, very simple. Maybe continue this out just a little bit. Just add some more detail. There we go. Take a little away from here. Now, in the grass here, you see these lines, these little lines. What we actually have to do is just go in and just correct them. What I'll do is just grab pieces that people haven't really seen and little bits of detail here and there, just to make it look varied. What you don't want is repeating patterns. So after you lay down the base, foundation here, we're just going to get rid of repeating patterns. Here, repeating pattern. Let's get rid of that. Here, repeating pattern. Repeating patterns. And other than that, it wasn't that bad, actually. So let's zoom it out a little bit. Let's say, first thing that we had Roman maintenance, and now what we've done is we've removed it. That's actually quite a big before and after. And again, it's not correct, it's not prospectively correct, but it's close. And as long as it's close, nobody's ever going to know. They're going to know if this is there, they're not going to know if that's wrong. So we'll go ahead and save this result and move on to the next step. I'm going to name this layer here Roman maintenance fail. And we're going to go ahead and make this a blend again. We're just going to take it to a folder. Call it blend. Do that hotkey, Shift Option Command E to make a new layer. I've been focusing a little bit on Nik Color Efex, so now I'm going to shift the attention away from Nik Color Efex a little bit to talk about ON1 software. Again, ON1 is another software that you're able to download and use. It's very similar to Nik in that it has a lot of effects, but you apply them in a different way. Again, there may be a discount code here in the PDF that we offer if you want to. If you want to download it, try it out. If you like it, feel free to buy it and support them. They're a great company, and they have a lot of tutorials on their website that'll teach you how to use all of the effects. But I just want to jump a little bit out and actually do something different. So before we went filter and we did Nik and all the other things, this time we're actually going to go to automate, and we're going to pick Perfect Effects 9 Suite. When I do that, it's going to take this layer out and bring it into its own software. I'm actually running a trial right now as well, so I'm going to click on Continue Trial. They give you 30 days for free. On the left here, you're going to see tons of presets. We're not really going to be looking at those right now. Maybe in a maybe in a future chapter, but not right now. Basically, what we're going to be looking at is right now we have layer 1. Here on the right is where we have layers. It's very similar to the way Photoshop works and functions. So with an MD layer, we can actually put a filter. And that's actually very powerful. So we're going to do a couple different things. First thing we're going to use is what's called a color enhancer. So right now what's really cool is I can add a color enhancer here, and you can see that on top of there I have a color enhancer layer, and I can toggle it on and off. And later I'm going to be able to mask it. But basically I don't want any of the auto color on there. I actually just want this set to default. So I'm going to take auto off, and you can see that now when I took auto off, it's not going to pick its own custom color. It's going to let me do the same thing. So here's where I can actually set the hue, saturation, and the purity. Purity of highlights and shadow is something in here that's very cool. So by setting the purity, watch what happens when I set the purity of the highlights. You can see it starts to pull some of those saturation values out of the highlights, which is really nice. I actually want to do that. I want to pull a little bit of the saturation out of the highlights, and in the shadows you can see I can do the same thing. I can start to get rid, and you can see it happening right here, I can start to get rid of some of that color cast that's happening in the shadows. So right off the bat, that's a very powerful thing. I can also change different things here like the tint and the vibrance, so you can see I can change the warmth here overall if I want to, or the coolness. However I want to do this, I may want to add a little bit more coolness to it. And here's where I can add some more vibrance overall and color and tint and different things like that. So this works really well. It gives you a global way to change hue, saturation, brightness, color, temperature, tint, and some other things like that. It's a little bit different than the Pro Contrast, but it's still really nice. If we didn't do all of our color correction inside of Capture One, this is a really good one to start. Here's what's cool though, is we have one color effects layer on. It's very subtle, but it got rid of some of those problems. Might want to pull the purity up a little bit more. I can add a new one. And with the new one, I can add a new filter, and in this time, I'm going to use Tone Enhancer. The Tone Enhancer is really fun. By default, not so much. We're going to turn auto off because it tries to do something cool for us. We're going to make sure that nothing happens. But here is where we can actually start to add tonal contrast. So we have the same thing here. We have the overall contrast, brightness, shadows, and you can see as I start to turn the shadows up, it's going to add a little bit of tonal contrast here. This works kind of like Pro Contrast in that it adds a little bit of brightness and pop in the shadows. But then you can see in the highlights too, I can do the same thing. So it's a recovery. Here's where I can start to adjust and add contrast in the blacks and in the whites. So this is pretty cool. So if I start to add contrast in the blacks and the whites, I can mitigate it a little bit by adding shadows here. And you can see that before and after, I end up with a little bit more tonal contrast. Now this pulls all those edges in. This pulls a lot of the detail back in. And where I can also go is I can actually add detail. So watch what happens when I add detail. It adds a little bit of ridiculous detail. So if you're going to use detail and clarity, it's 1, 2, 3%. It's really basic. But what I'm trying to do here is add some more contrast just in the blacks and actually pull shadows and add a little bit of contrast. That's all I'm trying to do. I'm going to add one more right now. And I'm going to add something called dynamic contrast. So we'll go up to dynamic contrast. Dynamic contrast works just like dynamic or tonal contrast does in Nik, to where it adds really great contrast. But I don't want it everywhere. But you can see also right now, it gives me a pretty intense result. I definitely don't want the result to be that intense, but it basically works on small, medium, and large texture. So as I start to pick small, medium, and large, think of little details. If you want to pop little details, you can do that here, and it's going to be small texture, overall sharpness. Or if you want medium texture would be something like the sky. You can see that the sky pops into life just like that. But what if I don't want it to be on the entire scene? Well, I can actually go ahead and paint and mask different things. So you can see I can mask out or I can mask in. Now these hotkeys work very similar to the way they do in Photoshop. If I use the bracket keys, I'll turn this up. And you can see I have a feather and I also have opacity. And I can change all those things. So what I can do right now with a subtractive mask is I can actually go ahead and paint in and I can remove the areas that I don't want this contrast to happen. So let's say I just want it in the sky, or I just want it in that area. You can see that I'm actually masking this out. So it's very easy and very quick to go ahead and mask out the effects where you don't want them. And again, you can change the brush size. You can also change the feather of the brush up there on the top. Right now it's a 50% feather. That's indicated by the dotted line. So right now I just want some extra kick to the sky. We'll just go ahead and get some extra kick to the sky here. Paint out what I don't want. And now you can see I have dynamic contrast just to the sky. So now that it's just to the sky, I can add even more. I'll add some large detail up there, some more medium detail, and I can pop that detail right back in the sky. So let's go ahead and apply it. Take a look at a result now. We have perfect effects. So we have pretty cool result. It's a little bit different than Nik, but a lot of people prefer it, and it was able to mitigate a lot of that bad color that I had. So I really like the result. Again, this is a redundant layer. I will get rid of it. Now let's talk a little bit about the sky in particular. Take a look at this noise. Anytime you add contrast in the sky, you're going to get issues. You're going to get more noise. That's just a given. So what can we do about that? Well, let's try one more thing. Let's go back into Perfect Effects and let's see if there's any way that we can remove this noise. So we'll go ahead and do a File, Automate. We'll go back into Perfect Effects 9 Suite. Go up to filter here and I'm going to select noise reduction. Noise reduction is pretty cool, but we're going to have to zoom in a little bit to see what's actually going on. I'll go to my loop view and you can see now it's going to have to redraw the preview. While the preview is being redrawn, we'll go ahead and change some of this. So right now we have noise reduction, we have subtle, blue sky, color noise only, mobile, moderate, shadows only, strong. I leave it by default and I just change it to taste. So basically what I'm going to do is find the right balance here of luminance until that noise starts to go away in the sky. I can toggle this on and off so I can see that detail disappearing. Now again, you always have negative benefits of softening things because when you soften something, I'll wait for this to redraw. You can see that if I turn this on and off, I also lose those details in this object. So that's really bad. I can try to recover some of those details here by just pulling them back. So I have to find a good balance. I want to get rid of most of the noise in the sky, but I also want to retain some of the details in the foreground. And that looks pretty good. That's gone from this to this. We'll crank it up a little bit more, and I'm going to show you guys a way to fix this and use it selectively. So if you want to use the noise reduction here, that's how you use the noise reduction. Those are the basic options that you have. And let's go ahead and say apply one more time. All right, look at that. Perfect effects. You can see that the noise reduction, it looks okay, but I'm losing some of the rich detail in the foreground. I really don't want that. I like all the detail that I have in this column, and the sky reduction, the noise reduction, while it looks good in the sky, it gets rid of all that, makes it nice and soft and clean again. What I want to do is create a custom channel for this to exist in, and we're going to do that using a new technique. Truth be told, this noise reduction layer from Perfect Effects is causing a lot of problems in the foreground, so we essentially have to mask it in so it just affects the sky. So that's going to be a little tricky. What we're actually going to do is create a channel mask for it. Luckily, if we go into the channels here, if we look at our different masks, you can see that blue pops that sky against that background. And basically what I mean by pops is you can see the foreground here has a lot of darkness to it, and then there's lighter shades in the background. So what I'm going to do is what I call a channel selection. Not a luminosity mask, this is going to be a channel selection. Start by duplicating the blue layer. The blue layer as a blue copy, I can load curves. With curves loaded, I can go ahead and start clamping the levels. So if I pull this over here, I'm going to start clamping those whites, you can see. If I pull this over here, you can see that I can start clamping those blacks. It's pretty cool, actually. Now I can make this high key image, which works pretty well. Now what I'm going to do, this is really interesting actually, is I'm going to go ahead and clamp this. I can't apply this as a mask because it's basically destroy it. But I'm going to go ahead with the brush tool here, painting white. Now I'm just going to get rid of some of this extra white here, some of the extra white here, or actually just get more white in this image. And here's where I'm going to do something really sneaky. This is worthless by itself, but if I just use the magic wand, regular magic wand tool, and I click in here, you can see that it's going to create a selection. And it's going to create a selection right around those edges. And it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be close. So with that enabled, I'll go ahead and go back here, and you can see that I have a nice selection of the edges. If I really wanted to, I can go in and mask these, and I can do that by myself. But under layers, I can go ahead and apply this Perfect Effects mask just to that selection. So you can see now that's masked in, and what I get is basically a soft sky with all of my details intact. At this point, it's going to be up to you if you go in and basically lasso in these other areas here. So if you really, really want to, I'm not going to spend the time to do every single one, but if this was my image for my portfolio, especially if it was going to go to print, I may go ahead and knock these out too. So you can see I can go ahead and soften those edges, soften all that kind of stuff too, in between all of the columns. But for the most part, everything works, everything's good. May have lost a little bit of detail here and there, but for the most part, we have now a soft sky. So we're going to say, we'll call it, even though it's less than perfect, we'll call it Perfect Noise Reduction. And then we have Perfect Effects. So now we have our effects on top and our noise reduction underneath. Next thing I want to do is take that Perfect Effects layer, duplicate it, and select a high pass filter. Remember, this is the X-T1. The X-T1 is 16 megapixels. The Nikon D810 is 36. If 36 means that 3 pixels is pretty good, 3 to 5, then you want to try to work somewhere around 2, I'd say 1 to 3 for 16 megapixel. That's pretty good for screen. 2 is going to be a really nice intense effect. So I can say okay for that. Set this to overlay. Well, the nice thing is with this set to overlay, I get my chiseled edges, but nothing's going to apply to the sky because I have the sky on top as its own soft layer. So I've created my own sort of masking for this layer just because now the sky sits right on top. So that's actually a pretty cool thing. Let's take a look at everything overall. It looks pretty good. Let's actually do a few more things here. I may actually want to add some curves. Actually, what I'm going to do is go back to the channels. Let's create a luminosity mask for the shadows. And with a luminosity mask selected, or just crawling ants on your screen, you can always invert that with Command-Shift-I. So now I'm selecting the shadows, highlights. It doesn't really matter though, because when I create a curves layer, for example, I can just say curves here. It's going to create the mask that's selected, and at any point, I can just Command-I and turn it into a shadow mask. So essentially what this is going to do is it's going to protect the highlights, but it's going to allow me to adjust the shadows. Well, based on what we just did, remember in the channels how we just clamped something? We can clamp this too. So right now it's going to affect the sky. I don't want it to affect the sky. What happens if I clamp this down a little bit? Well, I can protect even more of the shadows. So I can basically just clamp this out a little bit, overprotect the shadows, overprotect the highlights. And now when I do this adjustment, when I change this, you can see that it's only going to bring the shadows up, which is pretty awesome. So what I'm going to do is bring this up just a little bit here, and we're going to pull it down just a hair, and we're going to create a little bit more interest, a little bit more gamma here in the foreground. And again, that's going to be fun because I can adjust this just with this really simple curve and create a little bit more contrast. Next thing that I want to do is just mitigate some of these color problems. Here's where it gets really fun for me. Let's take a look at these columns closely. These are partial marble, partial limestone. Most of this is limestone. What happens with limestone? Limestone in Europe is lit by tungsten or yellow light. It already decays, starts to turn yellow over time with grunge. So yellow on yellow means it's a yellow mess. So what I'm going to do is start to mitigate some of this yellow with a hue saturation layer. Go up to hue saturation. Select the yellows. That looks pretty good. Select more of the yellows. Let's get some of the greens in there too. I'm going to change the lightness a little bit and pull the saturation down. So far I've desaturated most of my image. Let's black that out. Let's do it selectively. So let's say I want to add some white to this. I want to take away some of that light. Let's pretend that Rome used clean white lighting instead of this yellow lighting. Let's just go ahead and remove some of that. Well, this is going to separate it from the background. I'll actually close this, zoom out, so we can see this effect overall when I start to remove some of the yellows. Now, this will clean this object. That's one thing that it'll do. But it'll also separate it from the background. So it's separating it away from a yellow object that's behind it, just by doing that very easily. This is also what I like to do. Here are these columns. This is marble. Parts of this is marble. Most of this is marble, actually, but it's different types of marble. So what I can actually do is go in, and you may find this really interesting, but I do this all the time. I'll pick like 30 here, and I actually will go in and paint out yellow in certain things. So by doing this, I am accentuating the fact that this is indeed clean white marble. All of this here, this marble is actually different stone composition than the marble around it. You can see these panels here where they have all the old Latin writing. That's also different yellow, different yellow, different yellow. So what I'm doing is creating layers of color separation. This is the kind of stuff that I do all the time towards the end. It's that last 5% of an image where you can make it from good to great, but also test your color skills. What should be, what tone, and what shouldn't be. So here, in any case here, I can go in, take these columns down, pull some of the yellows out just to create some separation, but I can also decide where to pull it out everywhere, here. So I can say, well, let's remove all of that color there. Let's take that out. Let's work on this column. Looks like this area was a little bit more white than the other one. How about the statue here? A little bit of that. We're basically just painting color. It's not that we're doing something that's dishonest to the image. We're actually fixing some of the color tones that didn't pick up in camera. So I can even clean these up a little bit. That might be a little too much, actually. Sometimes we want a little bit I'll go ahead and undo that. And here's a good example of, there's a lot of yellow. Let's take a very light-handed brush and just kind of remove a little bit of it here. And this is all done to taste. One other thing, now that we've removed some of the yellows, we've changed some of this, created more separation, I'm also going to add a layer, and this is going to be a simple fix. It's actually going to be a photo filter. And I'm going to select a green one. If I can find green. There's green. And I'm going to turn it up a little bit. And this is so that I can add some green into the grass. So the other thing that happens, greens get separated from yellows. There's not a lot of distinction because it's the next one over on the color wheel. So if I actually just start painting subtly green here, I can actually separate the green from the yellow. And if you look at this very closely, it's going to be subtle, but if I turn this on and off, you can see that I'm actually getting some of this green grass. So back here it'll be a little bit more evident. I can actually paint in, this was actually green, like it was actually turf. All this area here, since it looks mostly yellow, I can add more green, more green, more green. This is just basically separating tonality. It's what I call color separation. That grass that we painted in, a little more green. This grass here, we can mitigate some of the yellow. We can mitigate some of the yellow light by cleaning it. We're cleaning the yellow light, making it green. We can add green back in here. These are small things that we do. Small things. And they all add up to something in the end. Again, you can turn this up and down. Since it is a selection, you can either add more, which would be too much, or you can take it away. Usually somewhere around default 25 or 30 seems to do the trick. Let's take a look at our result. Last thing I'll do to this image, I'm just going to add some contrast overall. Overall contrast. Not going to use brightness and contrast, but I'm basically just going to bring up the midtones a little bit. Now midtones, if I say gamma boost, midtones, that's what this is. Quarter tones would be up here. So what I really want to do is I want to protect the highlights but bring the luminosity of the image up a little bit, and I want to protect the shadows a little bit, but drop them just a hair while I do it. It's going to be subtle, but it basically adds that extra little kick while protecting the highlights and shadows. And I'll zoom out to take a look at this as a whole. So now that we have some nice texture in the sky, it's softened, it's almost ready to print. There's no issues with it. This is a mirrorless camera. It's really easy to keep clean. I know there are no spots on the sensor. Now let's take a look at how we started. Here's where we started with the original RAW. Pretty nice straight out of camera. You can see it's got some dark problems. A beautiful scene, has a lot of potential, but with a little bit of work and a little bit of Photoshop, we were able to take it from something that was already really nice and make it look even better. Blend everything in, protect all of our highlights, and add texture, dimension, color separation, detail, and we're even able to selectively remove the noise from the sky without softening anything else in the image. And probably the most extraordinary thing that we were able to do here was remove that silly little thing that was plaguing me the whole time I was in Rome. Well, that wraps it up for this lesson. It's time to learn something new, and I'll see you guys back in the studio later.